Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. So we're here to discuss the future of the active distribution system operator. So a very interesting topic on which Sarah just released the report this morning. So you'll find the link in the chat if you haven't seen it yet. So to discuss the issue today, we've got three of the report's authors. So Michael Pollitt, Monica Giulietti, and Andrei Kovatariu, who are going to present the report's findings in a minute. And then this will be followed by a panel discussion with representatives from industry, national energy regulators, and the European Commission. So namely Sabine Krom from DG Ener, Charles Esser from SEER, Thorsten Knopp from E.ON, and Christoph Wagner from GRDF. But we'll go back to them in a bit. First, we'll start with a presentation by the academics who produced the report. In the meantime, if you've got any questions on the presentation or during the panel, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. So you'll have two boxes. You see the chat where you can chat basically, and there's a different one where you can drop your questions. So please drop them in there so we make sure we don't miss them. I'll try and take them at the end of the panel discussion. Also, this will be posted on YouTube later. So I think tomorrow. So you can always circulate this video within your organization after the event. So without further ado, let's just get started with the presentation. I'll pass it on to the authors. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I will be starting the presentation, and I would like to say it's a pleasure to discuss the work we've been doing in the past few months. I would first of all like to acknowledge the support we've received from sponsors and other organizations that have provided input for this work. They were ARERA, E.ON, GDRF, Ofgem, and Oregoni. And I would also like to thank very much the DSOs and the trade association that have responded to our survey and help us to circulate the survey in order to get the information about what is going on with European DSOs at the moment. So this report aims to look in particular to 5 areas associated with the role of DSOs. And this is a development from a previous SER report in 2021, where we were looking at optimal regulation for European DSOs. So these 5 areas, which are EV charging points and renewable gas refueling stations, decarbonizing the gas supply, optimizing energy storage assets and coping with flexibility requirement, indicative energy planning, and promoting bottom-up innovation in the area of system integration were derived by that previous from that previous research work. The way we addressed these issues and questions were via 3 methods. We ran a survey of European DSOs. We looked at case studies from outside Europe, California, New York, Australia, and Quebec. And we also did an in-depth investigation of several European case studies. Next slide, please. I will start with our attempt to define what we mean by active DSO, given that we are looking at the future role of active electricity and gas DSOs as part of the energy transition and system integration at local level. And we understand an active DSO as being one that has moved from being a passive operator at lower voltage or lower pressure gas network to one that engages in grid management and facilitates the activities that are associated with increasing amount of distributed energy resources and demand. And in the next couple of slides, you will get a few more details about how we identify or define different stages of activation, as well as a set of potential indicators that we propose in order to somehow measure how active DSOs can be considered, and also the incentives that the active DSOs faces. I will ask Andre, please, to discuss the next couple of slides.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So in more general terms, and looking at the recent evolution of DSOs, one can observe three stages of this transformation process. And while this figure that you're seeing now does not aim to be an accurate description of any single DSO, and nor to cover all the dimensions, all the relevant indicators, the evolution from left to right here highlights the challenges that both DSOs and regulators have faced and are facing in the span of this year's 2000 to 2030, and the significant changes that emerge. So the first phase, left-hand side, came with the unbundling and efficiency-inducing regulation. As DSOs increased their investments in the regulated asset base and reduced operational costs and improved their processes. That meant shorter lead times for connections, better billing, lower losses for electricity, and also higher safety and quality for gas distribution. The second phase, the one in the middle, started with the emergence of smart meters and what smart meters unlocked, the ecosystem that it unlocked. So we are talking about PVs, battery storage, EVs, prosumers in the electricity, but also biomethane, hydrogen, power to gas technologies in gas distribution, with DSOs basically adapting and incorporating these elements in their processes. Finally, the third phase, which is basically ongoing, is the shift towards the new focus on managing these new elements, these new grid resources in a manner that optimizes their use and DSO's operations. So this phase is also about the need for real-time flexibility, distribution level, but it also involves more active engagement in general with energy communities, with clients, between DSOs, so between peers, between DSOs and TSOs, for both gas and electricity distributors. On the next slide, in order to measure the level of activeness, if you want, how active a DSO is, regardless of being a gas or electricity distributor, one needs to distinguish the elements outside of the operator's control. We call them potential. They're on the left-hand side and on the left column in the table, from the ones that the distributors can influence. Actual one, we call them in the right column. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list that we are having here, but we looked on the 5 dimensions that Professor Giulietti mentioned at the beginning, and I'll just give you one example. So looking at the number of EV charging points or biomethane injection points becomes relevant and is illustrative for a DSO's activity after accounting the general evolution of EVs and biomethane production in the areas covered by that specific or those specific DSOs. And I'll hand it over back to Professor Giulietti. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. So I'll start with a brief description of the main characteristics of the survey and the respondents to try and somehow discuss its representativeness. So we had responses from 18 DSOs in the period between March and June this year, covering 14 countries and actually representing to an extent around a quarter of European electricity, gas and gas consumers. We have asked our respondents to rate their level of engagement between very high and very low or absent with different organizations and actors in the local energy sector. And we find varying levels of engagement across organizations and across areas, the 5 areas that we are focusing on. One of the key points that we've identified is that there seems to be very high levels of engagement in general with public authorities, national or local, and less with energy companies, energy communities, and civil society. We find the highest reported levels of engagement in relation to indicative planning activities, while the promotion of bottom-up innovation records lower average levels of engagement. We also asked our respondent to discuss the existence and the possible way of addressing barriers to engagement. And the two areas that emerged are regulatory and financial barriers, as I will discuss in a bit more detail in a minute. Next slide, please. So our respondents come from or operate in 14 different European countries, and we had responses of a similar number across electricity, gas, or both sectors. Next slide, please. The size tends to be based on number of customers is between 1 and 10 million customers. Overall, these companies serve 120 million electricity customers and 30 million gas customers, with a mixture of publicly, privately, or mixed ownership for the responding companies. Next slide. So as I was saying earlier, we've asked our respondents to rank the level of engagement between very high and very low or no activity. And we can see across the different dimensions that national and local or regional authorities are generally present the highest level of engagement across the 5 areas. In the case of dealing with local flexibility, we have low levels of engagement, in particular with other energy companies, which might potentially be considered as a reflection of competition in the market. Next slide, please. So in addition to the 5 areas that I've previously mentioned, we also look to the role of data exchange, which is, we think is particularly relevant in the context of active DSO. And here we observe that there are either high or very high levels of engagement across the board, all the different potential actors for this engagement activity, while, as I was saying earlier, promoting bottom-up innovation and other innovation-related activity in the areas of system integration tend to report low levels of integration. Examples were provided about engagement that involved legislation, permits, or specific projects with public authorities. And the barrier to engagement were mainly associated with obtaining permits or the legislative framework more generally. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, from the large number of the large amount of information that we received, we've identified a few main messages. We see higher engagement with national local authorities. We actually found a statistically significant positive correlation between the average level of engagement and large organizations, or organization operating in the electricity sector in particular. And across the dimensions or areas that we looked at, R&D activities related to system integration also report on average higher level of correlation. We asked about projects becoming business as usual, and we had found a limited number of examples being provided. They tend to be associated with e-mobility, transport, and flexibility projects. There is generally a positive view about the support received by national regulators, but answering a question about what better support could be provided, our respondents have mentioned support for investment in innovative activities and also a better definition of the roles and responsibilities of different actors in areas that are relatively new or just emerging. And I think Andrei will take over with the non-European case studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we looked in some non-European geographies to look for some cases that we could study, and I'll just briefly go through them because they are obviously in extenso in the report. So the first two bullet points are covering California in the US. First of all, a cap and trade system and also some low carbon fuel standards have supported the RNG adoption for cars and trucks. And various policy supported pilot projects were developed in this sense. But at the same time, in California, a network of public hydrogen stations have been developed, and thus an increase in fuel cell vehicles has been noticed. But although some other projects with hydrogen piloting projects and applications in the electricity storage in homes, and also other ideas for green hydrogen for industrial and shipping customers have been explored and are still explored. Moving on the East Coast, in New York, following the success of Con-Ed wireless alternative to wires model, it's becoming a widespread practice to look into that. And the success is mainly related to the regulators' openness towards new remuneration model and partnerships of DSOs with various flexibility providers. Moving forward, we are going north in Canada. So the government of Quebec and its decarbonization plan, medium and long-term plan, made available or ignited, generated the innovation on both technical and commercial part of Hydro-Quebec that basically puts together a dual energy system that uses gas as a heating option, as a heating technological option for very cold winters, and thus created basically clusters of customers and also allowed the creation of new innovative tariffs and business models. In Australia, on the other hand, the need to cover or to cope with the long transmission limits of the lines of matching the demand and the supply called for grid flexibility and especially storage facilities and systems. So two major storage facilities are already operational there. We are describing them in the report in extenso. And following the success of that, because they are operational for a few years now, an increased number of applications have been recorded at the national regulator level, and success can be proven there in these two already existing projects. Thank you, and I'm handing it over to Professor Pollitt.
Thanks, Andre. And so we moved on from these non-European case studies to look at 7 promising case studies from Europe in discussion with our project sponsors and thinking about what would make some good projects. So these projects look at the 5 areas that we identified as promising ones for the active DSO. And on the next slide, we begin to discuss the results from these case studies. Next slide, please. So the first set of case studies looked at road transport, and we found that road transport was well supported by DSOs. We had 2 really great projects which looked at buses in Paris and electric vehicles in the Netherlands. So evidence of good engagement with decarbonization of transport. Then we had 2 projects which looked at hydrogen and the injection of hydrogen into the gas network in order to decarbonize the gas system. That did demonstrate that blending was possible. They also demonstrated that repurposing parts of the existing gas network was possible, but clearly there was a need to scale those projects up to sort of utility scale level decarbonizations. Then we had a couple of projects which looked at flexibility solutions. Nice project in the Nice Valley in France, looking at gas and electricity dual fuel solutions for heating, and the GoPax project looking at a flexibility trading platform between DSOs and TSO. Again, they demonstrate that that sort of activity is possible at the DSO level, but the number of trades are currently quite small, and again, there's sort of issues about scaling that up. Next slide, please. The next area we were looking at was the role of DSOs in indicative planning. We had a nice case study from the UK looking at the energy systems map produced by the Energy Networks Association. That seemed to be a good example of how DSOs can engage in indicative planning. We also looked at the benchmarking of innovation indices and suggested that although there is good benchmarking of electricity DSOs and how innovative they're being, actually there's a surprising lack of benchmarking of gas DSOs and how innovative they're being, and that was one of the suggestions that we make in the report that could be fixed. Other things that struck us about looking at particular projects was the need for good cost benefit analysis of whether projects could be scaled up and whether what it would take to make them economic. And the case studies also highlighted the fact that while larger DSOs are often very good at innovation and at becoming more active, smaller DSOs could benefit from acting together and making use of national energy network associations, for instance, in order to scale up their activity. Next slide, please. So we're drawing some conclusions on all that we've looked at, both the survey, the case studies from outside Europe, the case studies in Europe. Good progress on charging points, gas refueling stations, and clear lessons that if you wanted to scale those things up, effective subsidies, allowing private sector activity and coordination across DSOs was a good way of doing that. The case studies do show DSOs are capable of taking a lead on many decarbonisation projects and capitalising on being more active. Evidence of economically viable roles for the DSO in promoting local flexibility, and also that gas networks can provide flexibility to the electricity network. Case studies from Quebec and Nice were good examples of that. Then we do think that indicative planning, something that the Commission is very much focused on in its new directives on electricity and gas, are promising, and there's more opportunities for the use of indicative planning, especially to help smaller DSOs. The case studies of becoming more active clearly demonstrate the role of public funding and innovation funding, and the utilities that have made use of those funding sources would tend to score more highly on rankings of innovation and smartness of distribution systems. Next slide, please. There are still challenges. It should be the case that joint working between electricity and gas DSOs, particularly to help with heat decarbonisation, is very important. We've got some good case studies showing that, the Quebec example being a good one, and the Nice one and the Dutch case that we highlight. However, if you were to look at those measures that we put up at the beginning of what data might you look at to measure how active a given DSO is, of course, many DSOs would be at very early stages of activity, and significant regulatory barriers remain in place for becoming more active. However, associations and group initiatives will certainly help small DSOs become more active, and more flexibility may require relaxation of certain unbundling rules, something that we discuss. Certainly, if you want third parties to facilitate more activity across a given DSO network, provision of data by the DSO, and incentives to collect and provide real-time data to encourage investments by third parties would seem to be important. Next slide, please. Then we go on to look at regulation and how that might be adapted to promote the active DSO. Clearly, the Commission has done quite a lot of work on this. The new gas package is very interesting because it's attempting to level up the legislation around gas to that around electricity. The gas package, of course, hasn't been implemented yet. It does need to be implemented at the national level. And with REPower EU, it's gas decarbonisation has become very important. And we do see a key role for biomethane in the decarbonisation of the gas network, and some countries such as France have shown very good progress in decarbonising their gas network through the use of biomethane, but that has been in the context of an effective subsidy regime which does not exist in many other European countries. Hydrogen blending, which a couple of our case studies looked at, and which doesn't get much response in our survey. This is still at a very early stage, and if we're going to have hydrogen in gas networks, there's still a lot of funding that's required for that to happen. We discuss in the report about potential inconsistencies between the Electricity Directive and the Draft Gas Directive. Interestingly, I don't think the Gas Directive mentions sector coupling, and we point out inconsistencies in the planning requirements around gas and electricity collaboration between the electricity and draft gas directives. Next slide, please. We do think that regulators need to insist on better financial analysis of innovation projects. Both this current report and our previous DSO report discuss large amounts of innovation, large numbers of innovation projects happening across Europe with the aim of creating a more active DSO, but actually the ex post analysis of what the regulator and the customer can learn from these projects is often quite weak, and that needs to be improved. Of course, activity, especially at the early stages, requires adequate financial incentives. All of the projects that we highlight, and certainly all of the survey evidence, says that adequate financial incentives are required to make DSOs more active, and the companies that are operating in more beneficial funding environments are more active. I think one of the takeaways from looking at what's happened in North America and in Australia is that if you want third parties, conventional energy system actors to get involved, whether they be oil majors or car majors or whoever, you need to put obligations on DSOs to respond to third-party initiatives to maximize the degree of activity. And then the final thing that we discuss in the report is, well, the EU has a new entity, the EU DSO entity, which is promoting the DSO and promoting the active DSO. Interestingly, that covers electricity at the moment. It's proposed in the draft gas regulations, part of the gas package, that gas DSO should be added to the EU DSO entity. We raised the question as to whether that is going to promote activity or not, and whether having a separate EU gas DSO entity to parallel what happens with transmission with ENTSO-E and ENTSO-G is something that should be considered. But whichever of these options is taken, EU DSO entity or entities need to emphasize and promote learning and to sort of filter all these innovation projects that we've got going and actually spread the lessons from them and the best practices around all DSOs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for a very interesting presentation. So we've got an hour left to discuss this report with our panelists. So you can see the photos here, names and titles. So we'll get it started. We'll start with reactions to this presentation and from everyone. Starting with Sabino, if you want to get started. So Sabino joining us from DG NR. Good afternoon.
Yes, hello. Yes, I guess you hear me now. Should be fine.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for having me here today, and also thanks a lot for having this webinar today on DSOs at the times where a lot of attention is on the wholesale electricity markets. I think it's important not to forget that there are other important parts of the electricity system that we need to look at for the future, and so the urgent should not overtake also the important, which is also the future role of DSOs in the energy transition and in the energy sector. Because as I think we all agree that DSOs they are at the very center of the energy transition, and they will have an essential role to play, in fact, for the energy transition and the decarbonization of the energy sector. So just to recall maybe two trends here, I think they were mentioned before, or developments, maybe it's better than a trend, is like that. Of course, a large share of the renewables are and will be connected at the distribution level, so they have to be integrated there. And in order to reach the decarbonization targets set by the EU member states, we have to see electrification of the end users, which will also affect the distribution grid. Of course, strongly it will mean you have additional load, but I think it also gives some opportunities because you will have additional sources of flexibility, which you should maybe make use of for your operations. But okay, these developments, for sure, it means that the way DSOs do business will change, is already changing, and will or should change more. DSOs, well, and that's the title of today, they will have to manage their networks more actively. And in doing so, of course, they will need to cooperate with multiple stakeholders to connect the new generation facility and to integrate new loads. So coming from the regulatory perspective, maybe a bit, and apologize if I more speak about the electricity system, but this is in fact my background and my daily work, so I know it much better. So I think this is already recognized at the European level, well, on a higher level in the legislation in the Clean Energy Package adopted in 2019, and in the electricity regulation and the electricity directive, which contains in fact a lot of provisions related to DSOs and trying to enable them or give them incentives to efficiently manage their grid. But having said that, I agree what is said in the report and which the findings, that the active role envisaged for DSOs, it's a work in progress. And maybe indeed looking, the Clean Energy Package was adopted in 2019. It needs to be transposed. I think 2 years, I guess they are short. Yeah, we are at the beginning of a process. So just maybe to mention some other conclusions that were also presented, which I found interesting, is yeah, so as the active role, it's like a work in progress. We also see that innovative system flexibility solutions at DSO levels, in fact, they're more at a pilot stage. It's also very much a work in progress, which indeed quite some attention is paid to from the Commission side and other stakeholders as well. And quite indeed, as you said, a lot of projects are ongoing there. Another issue I will word it a bit differently, is like the DSO can make an important contribution or to planning, and it should provide a better network information to stakeholders, because this will be important for them, like for example, to connect storage, where should it be placed, for publicly accessible recharging stations, in particular if it's big ones, or once we start to get more into more heavy transport, where should they best be located in order to minimize the impact of the grid. So for this, of course, network network information is quite crucial. Then also, as I mentioned before, and you also spoke, cooperation and engagement with other stakeholders going beyond national and local authorities, where I understand there is already quite a strong dialogue. Yeah, to conclude, maybe so while of course DSOs, they should be given, they should be incentivized to become more active and innovative, but this should of course not mean that they should venture into like new areas. So, but I would like to recall the neutral role in fact that DSOs have, and the electricity legislation in particular mentioned this to recharging points, storage and data management, while of course the DSOs should and have to cooperate with a number of stakeholders. They should keep their neutral role in this cooperation. Yeah. So, and with this, I'll stop with my first remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Sabina, and thank you for reminding us also of the importance of the national and local level when everyone is, yes, indeed, talking about a lot of very high-level macro changes. So thank you very much. Charles, do you want to keep us going with a serious perspective on this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Albert. Yes, first of all, let me just give a bit of a disclaimer that in that I mean, Sears Distribution Systems Working Group has not done a evaluation of read the paper, and this is not in a sort of official reaction of SEER or anything today. This is just more some thoughts that I get from seeing the presentation, which and secondly, I'd like to thank Sari for the report, which was very interesting. First of all, just because I see a lot of parallels with some of the work that's actually ongoing in SEER now and not actually released yet. So I think that's actually a good thing. It means that we're somewhere on the right track. You know, and also I'd like to mention, of course, the two of our members, Ofgem and Herrera, are supportive of this. I noticed about the high levels of engagement. I'm assuming that when you're talking about with national authorities, that sort of regulators grouped in with other non-regulatory national authorities there. But in any case, you know, I think that high levels of engagement are important when we talk about barriers to innovation. I mean, first and foremost, it's that you know, it's important that sort of discussion particularly between the regulated entities and the regulator. And I think then what I want to do is just note a few things that sort of came to mind during the presentation. One thing was about understanding better what's happening with DSOs and their data. That's something that we have identified is an issue that we actually are now in the process of hiring a consultant to do a project for us to help us understand that better, because we do think that there's some deficiencies there in understanding really the way that DSO data is used, how it can best be used for some of these kinds of active goals towards decarbonization, towards a more, as you define it, more active distribution system operator. So that's something that's on our horizon, and we're just starting that project now. I noted that the two things that you want from NRAs from regulators are better support for investment and better definitions for new areas. So that I will take that back to the working group. I note that you looked outside of Europe. That's a good thing. We did that recently with a report on dynamic regulation. We did take in an Australian example as well. That brings me to our reaction, a sort of more general point of reaction, which is that you know, for regulators, the idea of these, how are you going to get to all these more, as you would define it, maybe more active distribution system operator. For us, just maybe a more innovative distribution system operator, not just the distribution system operator that can achieve the climate goals that have been set, energy efficiency goals that are in the energy efficiency directive and so forth, is through dynamic regulation. We published two reports on that, one more general, one more specific to DSOs in terms of sandboxes. I think that that's really something that we'd be interested to hear about and look more into the report in terms of how does that dynamic regulation toolbox help regulators get these goals, whether it be regulatory experiments, pilot projects, pilot regulations, or regulatory sandboxes. They're all slightly different and have slightly different usages and are optimized maybe for different situations. And I don't go into all the details of the difference between the four of them, but I think that that's something important to take into account here. Yes, I would echo the European Commission in making sure that we keep that. In the end, regulators do want to keep that sort of distinction between regulated grid activities and competitive market activities, and so that's something regulators will be very insistent on. A few smaller points: benchmarking of gas DSOs. We hope to have a publication that will do that a bit more in October, so that might be something useful. The representative of the European Commission mentioned the clean energy package. Obviously, we published a paper about Article 32 and for the electricity DSOs, the how to implement the network development plans. That's something that's still in progress, so a lot of this still is yet to be seen. I would note, though, that you mentioned some of the issues of having that's problematic maybe for smaller DSOs. At the same time, under the smaller DSOs under 100,000 customers are often exempt from those, or can be exempt from those network development plans. So that's something to think about. But how do we deal with that? Another issue they mentioned is heat. This is a real issue because it gets back to NRA competencies, and many of our members have no competencies in heat. But you have European legislation that's going to be start to put make them think about heat, and so that's an issue. And actually, I have discussed this with people in the European institutions because it is a real issue. And finally, I do want to agree very much on the point of learning. Whether so we would call it dynamic regulation, these kind of toolkits. We want to learn from them, want to see whether they can be put into broader regulation, and then have those broader sort of outcomes deliver benefits that you define here as being part from an active DSO. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Charles. Obviously, a lot going on your end. So curious and happy to continue this conversation with you later and in the coming months. So let's hear it from the DSOs now. I'm sure you've got a lot of things to react to now after everyone's spoken. Maybe starting with Torsten from Aon.
Oh yes, we do have that. Thanks a lot for giving me the floor. I think it's an impressive study, and I like I think the results are very interesting, but I also like the approach. In particular, I like the survey that brings different perspectives on how the cooperation is working today, differentiated by the different partners that there are for the DSOs and the topics. I also think that we can draw valuable lessons from many of the case studies. So it's really an interesting and good study about the active system operator, or the active DSO to be precise. And of course, the active DSO, it's also a lot about system integration on a local and regional level between electricity and gas. And we've just heard that maybe also with heat, especially through the provision of flexibility, but also through integrated network planning, network development, maybe even network operation. That's one thing that we really have to work on. And if you want to see how examples can bring us forward, Michael mentioned Quebec and Nice. I agree with these. I would also mention the UK case study. That certainly also is a good one. But there's more. There's more than just system integration to this study. I think there's a huge potential that this study triggers and lays open of developing the role of the DSO. And that comes when we look into the relationship of the DSO, with whom is it there today and with whom should it be there tomorrow. And of course, DSOs today primarily interact with the authorities, because that's the people they have to deal with. But they're also interested in doing, and there's a lot of more potential to interact more with the civil society, with other actors, with also from other industries, to make things possible. And we've learned from the study, and we've also learned that in the presentation we've just seen, that then we can think about new roles to be played by DSOs on behalf of authorities, on behalf of the society, together with others on decarbonization projects. You've mentioned road decarbonization as a primary example. You mentioned indicative planning that we still have to develop, and where we basically are at the moment still almost nowhere. You mentioned the role of data collection and provision to others. And I think a good example of this, where you really sense that the role has to be wider and has to encompass more, is the current Commission measures on how to mobilize flexibility for crisis management in the immediate future, for this winter or the next. And you can, of course, say, okay, we have the different market roles, and the competitive actors come forward, and the system operators try to enable that in order to help them. But you can also think about, what can we do together? And I think there's not any conflict in developing this role and giving the DSO, in a certain aspect, a new integrating role. There's not any conflict with what Sabine said. This will be a neutral role. This will not be a role that will be a competitive activity, but it will be a neutral role together with others, together with authorities and the society. And it's also nothing that in principle is against CER that differentiates between regulated and unregulated activities. However, I think we have to think wider than the CER differentiation, what is regulated, what should be unregulated, under which circumstances, that was developed 2 or 3 years ago. So I think this is the impulse of the study. Let's do things together. Let's go forward. Let's recognize the potential of larger DSO, of integrated, of non-integrated, of smaller DSOs. Let's unleash innovation, and let's unleash the integrating potential of a system operator together with others, without being a competitive actor, but still, of course, being a regulated monopoly. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Thorsten. Very interesting take on the role of the DSOs in coordinating other stakeholders also. Christophe, do you want to add to what Thorsten has said? So Christophe joining us from GRDF in France.
Yes, thank you, Albert. So maybe a few words about us to start with. For ones who do not know us, so GRDF is the main French gas distribution company, and the largest one in Europe, since we are operating a 200,000 kilometers long network, and we've got 11 million customers. As such, considering where we are, our belief is that existing gas networks are key assets to successfully transition to carbon neutrality. And we are fully mobilized within the company to encourage the injection of renewable gas into the French distribution network. So when we decided to sponsor the study, we had basically 3 key ideas in mind. And we wanted first to demonstrate that distributors are a key element for the energy transition. And we have a key role in the decarbonization to play, both for gas and electricity. Second point, we wanted to demonstrate that gas and electricity distributors have an interest in working together for better integration of energy system. And third one, we were looking for concrete example reflecting the evolution of the role of the distributors and attesting of the flexibility and the smartness of the networks. So, and basically, we are very happy with the conclusion of the study, and we believe the study confirms that distributors have a key role to play in the energy transition. Indeed, in fact, the study highlights through a couple of concrete examples that the existing and emerging synergies between gas and electricity distributors. The study demonstrates how this action can work with national and local government to become more active in the energy transition by promoting the integration of systems, especially in the transport and heating sectors. Overall, the study recognizes that fostering collaboration between gas and electricity DSOs is essential to achieve deep decarbonization of the energy system. What we can see is that to encourage this, the report concludes that electricity and gas regulations in different countries need to be aligned and supportive. For DSOs like us to fully play the active role they can, and we believe they should have in the energy transition. The study also stresses that collecting and sharing data in real time is essential. Well, what we can see as well in the report is that nevertheless, this development and progress in the integration of energy systems are clearly linked to the question of the resource. And to be honest, we are very happy by the fact that the report highlights the importance of biomethane development, which is defined as a key element of decarbonization in several countries. And this is true, especially in France, where, as you know, biomethane is already playing a key role. Finally, what you can say is that the study insists that also better integration is possible and already on the way. The study demonstrates that as well, we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. For electricity DSOs, the energy mix leads to a higher tension on the network, especially on system stability. And for us, for gas DSOs, we need to organize ourselves to inject more and more green gases into our networks. Just to finish, Albert, I would like to thank the academic team for the quality of the work which has been performed, and for the continuous dialogue with the sponsor which has been performed during all the study.
Thanks a lot, Christophe, and thank you for participating. Starting with you, Christophe, so I'm going to ask everyone one follow-up question in reverse order, just because we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and keep it short. But starting with you, Christophe, you talked about the challenges that the DSOs are facing. What do you think is the key? What are the top challenges DSOs are facing now, and what tools should be available to face them at the moment? And I'll ask the same questions to everyone after you.
Okay, so I think the report demonstrates that we are all committed to transforming the energy sector into a net zero emission environment. As a DSO, we do believe that to be able to meet that ambition, a solid working relationship with regulators and policymakers is key. The goal would be to structure the most appropriate and beneficial solution for consumers. And we can say that this would be about integration of transport, where electric and gas mobility complete each other and offer options to end users. And second point would be flexibility in heat consumptions, with key attention to avoid and limit peak demand and create large demand side capacity, especially for hybrid heating solutions. We do believe from our side that all technology options should be treated on an equal basis and evaluated in terms of their effective decarbonization potential and their costs in an energy system perspective.
Thank you very much. Very good points on transport and hybrid heating. Thorsten, same question to you. What do you think are the key challenges and how to address them in a nutshell?
The study says that the active DSO is not a reality yet. I would doubt that. We are trying to become as active as we can. But maybe what we still have to do, both gas and electricity and gas DSOs, is to challenge the borders that we think that are locking us in. Picking up projects, as I said, doing that together with other actors, with people from outside the industry, with the local authorities, with and then go forward and challenge the framework, challenge first of all the respective NRA to have a look whether we can do that, then challenge the member states, and of course challenge also the legislation on a European level. And I would not say that we are not well on a way to the active DSO from the DSO side, but we could be more daring. We could be more outgoing there, and we could be trying to generate these opportunities and then say, this is the opportunity. Do you want it to happen? Do you want us to do this in a neutral way for others, or don't you? And that is probably would be a good step for the DSOs forward. I'm a bit sad that the question is lost what the regulators should do, because of course I would have a long list what still should be done and how they could enable it. But if you ask about DSOs, that's probably it. Yeah.
I mean, feel free to add something. What you think regulators should prioritize? I'm sure Charles is listening. If you want to add something on that.
I'm not saying enable investments, yeah, but I think they should rethink in an innovative, open way, rethink the delineation between what DSOs can do and what they can't do, and without foregoing the differentiation between being party and neutral, or being unregulated and being regulated, but push the borders and be open for new models, and as a first step, maybe be open for new projects that explore these possibilities. And I think there are a lot.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give Charles a chance to react to this also. It's your turn now, so maybe adapt the question a bit for you. Let you react to Torsten maybe, and also maybe you can tell us what are the priorities maybe at SEER on the DSO front for the next few months.
Okay, and thanks very much, Albert, and thank you, Torsten. Indeed, just to go back to your first question, because I was just sort of thinking about that when you first posed it. Obviously, for gas DSOs, decarbonization is, of course, and decommissioning are medium to long-term huge challenges. The move to hydrogen is certainly a challenge, and what happens, with DSOs on hydrogen. On the electricity side, of course, with dealing with the network with increased electrification, VRES, sector integration. These are all things I think that are not going to be surprises to this audience. I mean, Torsten's point is an interesting one. Obviously, regulators have spent a long time trying to think about, what is the proper role of the DSO, or the TSO for that matter, and and trying to make sure that the market is allowed to function, and sort of protecting the market from the monopoly and its power. Are there places where we need to rethink that? Perhaps. I mean, there was a project in the Netherlands that exempted the unbundling requirement but it was mostly used for cooperatives and housing associations. So I mean, there was a kind of regulatory sandbox there. I mean, I think we in the last year we have published a couple of papers where we really do think that we need to expand the use of these sort of, let's call them dynamic regulation methods, to try to adapt to the new market. And while not every NRA in Europe has made good use of them, certainly many have. I mean, you have some there. I think probably in your case studies, we have some ourselves. I think we found in our own internal questionnaire to our members that about 15 of our members had been using such kinds of projects to promote innovation. So I think that's there. I think dialogue with the DSO is important. Certainly, Torsten has been to SEER workshops in the past, but and so regulators have heard what he has to say. I'm interested in this idea that we need to push the borders a bit. At the same time, of course, regulators are by nature cautious and will want to make sure that things are tested first and things are done very carefully where these borders are pushed forward in terms of the line between, for where DSOs start to get into, let's say, activities that have traditionally been thought of as part of the competitive market. That could be because they need to interact with other entities. I know you mentioned more interaction with civil society, more interaction directly with other industries. I think that is something that we need to think more about, particularly civil society. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it with that, but good feedback today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Charles. And so Sabine, I'm gonna let you give you a chance to conclude this panel and maybe react to some of the other speakers' comments. Then, so we'll go over by 5 minutes if that's agreeable to everyone, and I'll take a couple of questions to the audience, and then I'll give a chance to the academic team to quickly conclude the webinar. Sabine.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have so much to add. So indeed, telling you about what is the biggest challenge for DSOs, I think it's the DSOs who are best placed to tell you what their biggest challenge is. So I can say rather like what are the priority areas we are looking at a bit at the EU level at the moment. So what I think, as I said at the beginning, of course, the biggest challenge, put in more broader terms, means is to integrate the renewables and to the increased load coming from electrification and how to handle this. So what we discussed today, one important tool for this is to have the DSOs, a more active management of the grid will be needed, like to limit costs. But maybe it hasn't mentioned here today, or it has only been mentioned one. But a second important part, of course, is still investments into grid infrastructure outside distribution grid level, which we know will be very significant and which will also be a challenge for DSOs and how to finance them. But this, of course, it's a different discussion. Yeah, just one sentence, although we are going over time. I think on the EU level, a lot of a framework has been set, which we have to, well, we shouldn't sit and wait how it goes, but of course it has to be implemented and hopefully it will have some results. It doesn't mean that on the go we will discover things which we should change and adjust, but I think at the European level, I don't see so many discussions ongoing on what should be done there on a regulatory basis. Of course, we still have some work streams ongoing, which I would shortly like to mention is like the implementing acts on consumer data. Where there's a work done on this, and we're working on secondary or network code legislation to unblock on demand side flexibility, which for DSOs it's a very important topic. And with that I will stop.
Thanks a lot, Sabine, and rightly emphasizing the importance of implementation, especially at a time where a lot of legislation and regulation has been pushed out at European level and will need to be rolled out at national level in EU member states. So Michael's made my life a little bit easier by answering a lot of the questions that were dropped in the chat, but I'm still going to take them. So I see that Tim Ryan, who I think is joining us from Australia, had a few questions, and then it was Michiel Rox from Allender, I think, in the Netherlands. So I'm going to try and group the questions a bit and see if they may be a bit thorny. So let's see if someone wants to take them. But Michael has already provided some answers in the chat. So the first one from Tim, grouping some of his questions, I think, is how does the current gas squeeze in Europe affect the respective roles of electricity and gas in the energy mix and in Europe's future energy mix, and particularly when it comes to green hydrogen and what place for green hydrogen in transport going forward in Europe. So that'd be my first question, and then there's another one from Michiel that I think was on regarding the EU DSO entity. If what we're preaching for is greater sector coupling, what's the case for having a separate gas DSO entity? So does someone want to take one of these questions to start us with?
I can take the entity one.
Yeah, Thorsten, please.
Yeah, I only can say you're correct. And one of the strongest arguments for an integrated entity is to say, if we want to integrate sectors, why don't we integrate the entity and think together also in rulemaking? Other arguments against that are probably saying the structure could be very complex. So you have to use the opportunity to streamline the structure of it. Because the structure of the electricity entity already is very complex. And the other argument that also can be overcome probably is to say, who's then going to prevent electricity DSOs deciding on gas things and the other way around. But I think that the argument opening the horizon is the one going for one entity, and it's exactly what you are asking. I cannot say, no, this is not the case. Yes, there are arguments that go for two entities, but I think they can be overcome, and you're basically opening up the perspective and saying that that's what we have to go for.
Anyone else? Maybe Christophe from GRDF. Do you have a take on this?
Yeah.
On the UDIS entity?
I think we support the proposal which has been made regarding the creation of a gas entity. at the end of the day, we do believe that we need to make sure that there will be a clear voice for gas DSOs, especially to coordinate the development of all renewable gases, biomethane, hydrogen, syngas. At the end of the day, the two entities, gas and electricity, would of course have to collaborate to promote energy system optimization. That means identify the complementarity of their network to minimize, that was what we said, the overall investment, and then to create a joint framework facilitating the development of smart grid projects in relation to the EU regulation. But basically, yes, we do believe that we need for sure a clear voice for gas entities, gas DSOs. Yeah.
Thank you both. So whatever the option chosen, gas, there's need for greater cooperation, and that should be implemented. Thank you very much, Michael. Maybe because we don't have much time left, so maybe Michael can speak on behalf of the academic team, and then maybe Monica and Andre, if you want to add something after that.
Well, thank you to everybody who's commented, and thank you to the panelists. Yeah, let me just say a few things which resonated in what people had said. I think no one's arguing for a dismantling of the neutral role of the DSO, but on the other hand, we live in a world where if something is obviously not being done, we need somebody to do it. And I think Torsten was sort of indicating, well, maybe there is a missing institution in terms of local coordination, and the DSO might need to have a role in doing that. And clearly, as soon as you say that, then, well, hang on, if it may not be economic for third parties to do some things. Anyway, so derogations may be useful. The other thing I like, Charles made a couple of lovely points about innovation versus activation. Now that's a really interesting point, because I think we've got a lot of innovation at the DSO level, but the activation is, as the report discusses, is only in its early stages. And I think the danger for the whole of the EU and Europe on the DSO is we spend our lives being innovative without actually delivering net zero. And at some point we need to pick winners, we need to decide what the innovation is telling us, and we need to scale up the things that are going to deliver net zero. So, at some point you've got to move beyond just innovation. The other nice point that Charles made, which I think is a future SARE report, Charles, is about these 100,000 or less DSOs, customers with, and actually, given that they might have a significant number of customers in aggregate, we can't afford to not to exempt huge sections of the energy network from delivering net zero. And we do need to think about, well, is it just the case that these entities have actually ceded their indicative planning to the higher voltages or the higher pressures? If that's the case, that's okay. Then somebody is doing indicative planning above them. But if actually these are just areas where there's no indicative planning, that is something we need to worry about. Torsten, yes, yet another SARE report on where is DSO going from here. Yeah, there's more to be said, isn't there, about how we. What I would like to do is having set out how you would measure the active DSO, we do need to now benchmark different DSOs against each other and say, well, here some are really a lot more active than others. Why are these others lagging, and what can we do to help them? And then, Christoph, I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about this report was anybody who reads it will think that this is about both electricity and gas. We've bent over backwards to discuss both gas and electricity DSOs. All of the case studies are balanced across electricity and gas. And I certainly commend the report to people who are interested in learning more about gas DSOs, because we've got quite a lot to say about that in the report. And I certainly agree that if we're going to decarbonize heating, we need to take gas DSOs seriously. And the report also illustrates the role of gas DSOs in transport decarbonisation. So you know, one of the good things about this report, I think, is its even-handedness between gas and electricity. But once again, thank you to all our stakeholders. Thank you to my fellow authors. I couldn't have done it without you. And to our panelists today.
Thanks a lot, everyone. We're 11 minutes over time, so I'm sorry I'm going to have to end this now. But if anyone's got questions, remark for us, please do get in touch. You've got the link to the report. If you'd like to discuss some of its findings, just write us an email or give us a call, and we'll be happy to connect on that. Team especially, I think if you've got more questions for us, we'd be interested to hear from the Australian experience a bit more. All right, thank you very much to our panelists and to our presenters. Again, thanks for joining us today. Thanks to obviously our attendees also. So hopefully we'll see each other soon again to talk about DSOs, probably next year. In the meantime, our next event will be on October 11 on, guess what, Sabine? Wholesale market design.
I've seen it, yeah.
So yeah, but we've got more also coming up on energy data sharing, something that's very much relevant to DSOs, and that will be at the end of October. So thanks again, and have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.